to Rogue Refinery, Episode 3, the show where creativity and innovation reign supreme as we build around some of the coolest cards in Magic. I'm AliasV, joined by Paul Cheon, as always, and Paul, I am so looking forward to seeing what the Faithless Brewing boys come up with for this week's card.
Yeah, really interesting card to build around. Lots of challenges, actually, to building around a card like this. So again, I mean, so many different directions you can go, but the Faithless Brewing guys have not failed us so far, so I expect some pretty big things from them.
This week's card, it is an elemental cat. It is an elemental flying cat with first strike. Care to hazard a guess, friends? All right, I won't make you wait too long. It's Vadrok, Apex of Thunder. And this guy, it's quite a fun card to build around. He's got some interesting things you can do. It's another mutate creature, so the new mechanic from Ikoria. What are some of your first instincts when you look at this card, Paul?
Well, so when you look at just kind of the base rate of this card, and you're like, okay, 3 mana, 3/3 flying first striker. That looks great, but in general, in standard, that's kind of below the bar in terms of a card you would just normally play in your deck. So, of course, what you want to be doing with a card like this is mutate. You want to be able to find the best ways to kind of take advantage of the fact that you can mutate this onto creatures and then get value out of it. That's what you want. Of course, casting it is also fine if you need, but you want to be able to mutate. And I think there's a couple of cool things you can do. We've seen Jeskai tokens variants have success in the past. I mean, it's top-aided Pro Tours before, where you try to basically cast cards like Raise the Alarm, Forbidden Friendship, and then just find a way to be able to recast those cards. And that's what Vadrok allows you to do. You get a token onto the battlefield, mutate Vadrok onto one of those tokens, recast those spells, and boom, all of a sudden you have an army again. So a lot of different ways you can take this. I'm really curious to see if this is actually something that you can make happen and have it be competitive in standard, because again, the challenge here, the real challenge is having that right balance of creatures and spells in your deck, because you need to have enough spells to buy back, but you also need to have enough creatures to mutate onto.
Without further ado, let's hear from the Faithless Brewing boys, Dan, Damon, and David, how they got along with this week's card. Dan, let's start with you.
Hello. Yeah, so I was tackling standard this week. I think you guys said it exactly right in the intro. The stats on Vadrok are just so-so, but that mutate trigger, that looks really good to me. So I think this card could potentially be great in standard. I went and did my research, looked around to see how other players were using Vadrok. There's nothing. The card is seeing no play whatsoever. That being said, I have a build that I really like, and I think I did quite well with. So either I'm crazy or everyone else knows something else that I don't.
Well, I'm keen to see what you've got for us. David, how to pioneer shape up?
When you were mentioning disaster earlier, it was a little bit closer to that. I built 5 different shells, and the card can do a bunch of kind of fun things at times, but Paul was very correct when he talked about the mix of creatures and spells and effects, and then are you getting paid off enough for it? And that mix proved to be tricky enough to consistently win games against the current Pioneer meta.
All right, and Damon, what did it look like in Modern?
Yeah, so I followed Dan's research idea. I found a 5-0 zoo list, tried it out. Ooh. I drew 3 to 4 Vadroks every game and not much else. Too many Vadroks, it turns out. So I wound up going my own way with a different deck and Jeskai tempo style. And I have a lot to talk about. Deck was pretty interesting.
All right, well, David and Damon, we will hear from you guys in a little bit. We're going to focus first with Dan in Standard. So let's get right into it.
All right, so Dan, I think I talked about this earlier in the show where, there was this token shell that you could potentially build Vadrok around, where you have spells that create tokens, and then now you can rebuy those spells by mutating onto those things. Now, historically, there has been success at the Pro Tour, at the professional level, for various token-based strategies. I mean, Jeskai token specifically top-aided a Pro Tour by Martin Mueller. Of course, very different deck, but at the same time, it's playing ways to make a bunch of tokens. It's got a powerful blue, red, white card in it, Jeskai Ascendancy. But, you're trying to go wide and try to pump your team. Now, is this kind of the baseline strategy for what you wanted to start with?
I think so. Yeah, that's actually the first place that I looked. Thinking about that tension you outlined where you need to find non-creature spells to put in your graveyard for Vadrok to recast, while also having plenty of creatures in play for Vadrok to mutate onto. So I assembled kind of a baseline Boros tokens list. I went to the cards Forbidden Friendship and Raise the Alarm as my go-to token makers, and I rounded that out with a selection of cats, dinosaurs, and elementals so that Kahira, the Orphan Guard, can be my companion. Took that into the events, and I learned some quick lessons, let's just say.
Now, what were those lessons specifically? Because everything that you mentioned sounds really exciting, especially being able to get Kahira as your companion to have a way to kind of pump up your team for free every single game.
Yeah, so between having a companion and having Vadrok to recast spells, what I hoped would happen was that I would have just endless things to do, a never-ending wave of tokens. And that is indeed actually how it played out. I had a lot of great starts where just turn after turn, I'm adding more things to the board. I'm recasting spells like Light Up the Stage and Skewer the Critics that are worth 3 mana, but I didn't actually pay 3 mana for them. So it seemed to actually be doing its thing quite well. Unfortunately, the opponents just seemed ready for this. They seemed amply prepared. I ran into a number of Shatter the Skies. I faced a Urian deck where they were already playing Omen of the Sun. Very discouraging turns where I'd send in, I was so pleased with myself. I had 3 or 4 tokens in play. I'd send them all in, and down comes Omen of the Sun, wipes out half my attackers. Urian comes down, blinks 2 Omen of the Suns. They all come back. They cast a 3rd Shatter the Sky of the game. And at that point, I realized I'd pretty quickly hit the limit of what a token strategy could do. Vadrok makes it quite good at doing the one thing that a tokens deck can do, but it didn't add that second dimension that would let me keep up with the opposing decks once they started fighting back.
All right, so tokens didn't really work. What was the next approach that you tried?
Yeah, so went back to that question of what is Vadrok going to be recasting from the graveyard when I mutate it. I think that a lot of the power of the card is directly tied to what are you getting off that trigger, how much is that card worth, and secondarily, how often are you actually using the mutate trigger? The first time you mutate Vadrok, that's pretty good, but where it really gets exciting is the second, the third time you're getting the mutate trigger. Sometimes you can even do it 2 or 3 times in one turn. So what I was interested in was a deck that had something very powerful to rebuy, namely Teferi, Time Reveler. I don't want to bury the lead too much on that. I kind of knew that was going to be Vadrok's best friend. So I wanted to rebuy Teferis a lot of times, and I wanted some more mutate friends, so I turned to Sea Dasher Octopus as a tricky way to even get mutate triggers at instant speed. That led me to a more Jeskai tempo mid-range style build that I think is actually quite strong.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting approach that you took here. I think maybe some people might not necessarily know that Vadrok actually gets back any non-creature spell, right? Not just spells. You're thinking a lot of times you have these spells decks, you think instant or sorcery, but the fact that you can get back planeswalkers is huge, and that seems to be like the best way to get value from Vadrok.
Yeah, absolutely. A card that can recast a planeswalker for free. We've seen how powerful it is with Fires of Invention. This is my own version of Fires. Every time I trigger Vadrok, I'm getting not just 3 mana, but a really powerful 3 mana play. That I even cast its own spell when it comes back ready to bounce something. So I think that landing on Teferi as the main thing that I wanted to really be leaning into in the Jeskai build was the key step in making Vadrok feel not just cool, but actually powerful.
All right, this deck looks pretty sweet. Now, how did it do?
Yeah, it took a little bit of tinkering, but once I got the build into a configuration that I liked, I took it into the best of 3 event, and I got to 5 wins right off the bat.
Nice.
It took a loss along the way, but I was really happy with the performance. I played a few more matches. I think 7-2 overall was my final score with the deck.
Nice.
All right, so I mean that's a really, really impressive finish for something to build around. I think that's one of the best finishes that we've seen. And you have a lot of really interesting cards that look like they're on the cusp of being standard playable, but people really haven't found a home for them yet. Just briefly, could you talk to us about Sprite Dragon as a card and how it performed in your deck?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of my favorite cards from the deck. So Sprite Dragon, what does that have to do with Vadrok? It's not necessarily obvious that you should play them together. Sprite Dragon will grow every time you cast a non-creature spell. But the biggest thing I learned about Vadrok was that Vadrok can't win the game by itself. Vadrok needs friends, whether that's creatures to mutate onto or powerful spells to recast. Also, it's just not the kind of card that can close the game out by itself. It really functions best when it's your follow-up play. So you need something that's going to get you on the board early, close game out, apply pressure, make them answer that, and then once they've had to react to your first threat, Vadrok comes down, brings back something strong, and it makes for a huge tempo swing. So Sprite Dragon was actually my go-to creature for getting on the board early, causing some problems, taking out opposing planeswalkers, and just getting to very large sizes.
And it also seems like the ability of just having counters. I mean, this is something that I've interacted with a bunch, just playing limited, where even cards like Fertilid get huge because it has those 2+1/+1 counters. Was that really, really huge in your matchups with Sprite Dragon?
Yeah, absolutely. So +1/+1 counters are probably the best way to make mutate triggers really impressive. We talked about how you get a spell back when you mutate the Vadrok. You also get perhaps a power and toughness bonus. That really depends on the base power and toughness of what you mutate onto. So if you're thinking, I like to play Bone Crusher Giants, I like to play Brazen Borrowers, those are good cards, but they don't really grow from the Vadrok. If you have something small like a Sprite Dragon, that will actually grow by 2 whenever you mutate onto it. The +1 counters are added to your mutant's sort of final stats. So I was actually really impressed by the +1/+1 counter creatures that I was able to use as my sort of base creatures for Vadrok to hop onto.
And it's not just Sprite Dragon you have. I see you've got Chamber Sentry in here too, which I haven't seen since, limited days where I sit there looking at it. Okay, maybe we could play this. And half the time it just ends up, on the sideboard of your limited deck. But how did this card perform for you? Because it's also got, the cool ability where it's able to remove counters and ping things if you need to. So another really good card to have in this deck.
I think you said it exactly right. I have not seen my Chamber Sentries since I drafted them and put them in a little bin somewhere in my house. This is not a card you commonly see played and constructed. We do see Stonecoil Serpent played a lot more. It has a nice suite of abilities. Unfortunately, one of those abilities is protection from multicolor.
Yeah.
So you actually can't target it with Vadrok. Yeah. So if you want something that gets that nice +1/+1 counter bonus, Chamber Sentry is actually your go-to creature. What I found was that this card vastly overperformed my expectations. I was playing a full playset, and I was actually really happy whenever I had one in the opening turns. I was about to say on turn 1, but actually what's so great about it is that in this deck, you have 3 colors, so it can potentially be a 1/1, a 2/2, or a 3/3.
Yeah, nice. That just kind of fit in wherever you need them. So
yeah, exactly.
It's a really good target. So yeah.
I mean, versatility is the name of the game for these Jeskai tempo decks. You don't really know what the board situation is going to call for, what kind of attacking plan your opponent's going to bring at you. Maybe you just want a 1/1 to get on the board quickly, or maybe they're attacking you with 1/1s and you just want a 3/3 that is out of range of Shock and Bone Crusher Giant.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. When we were kind of designing Stonecoil Serpent, one of the goals for the card was maybe people would consider it as an option against all the opponent's multicolored removal spells, but somehow this card has managed to hose you instead because of that protection from multicolored cost. I don't know. That's just really funny to me because we thought it was a bonus, but at least in this case, it's actually something that prevents you from playing this powerful card.
Yeah, so Chamber Sentry is maybe not your first XX creature that you would turn to, but I think it performed quite well. It really loves to receive a mutant. Even a Sea Dasher Octopus. I mean, imagine that you start the game with a 1/1 Chamber Sentry on the first turn. On turn 2, I could flash in a Sea Dasher Octopus, and I'm attacking now with a 3/3 that draws me a card every time I connect for damage. In the later turns, I might have a 3/3 Chamber Sentry. I could mutate Vadrok onto that, rebuy it to Fairy, and suddenly I have a 6/6 flying first strike because it gains the 3 counters from the Chamber Sentry.
Nice.
That can tap to destroy things too if I need to.
Yeah. And
it does it all.
Yeah, for sure. And, one thing that I'm also noticing when I'm looking at this build, you talked about how the tokens deck failed because there's just a lot of ways that opponents can just kind of gum up the ground with, the various omens and all that stuff. But your deck has a lot more evasion. So, I'm looking at these 2 copies of Staggering Insight. I mean, these cards look like they could be really, really powerful in this shell.
Yeah, that was a late addition or a late find, I should say, but I'm really happy that I included them. They actually performed super well for me. We saw a little bit of aggro resurgence in the past week. I faced a lot of red decks, a lot of decks that were trying to pressure my life total, get on the board quickly. What I found was that a Staggering Insight, in addition to drawing cards, just that lifelink is so important. I could get a lifelink flying creature down, even something like a Spectral Sailor, add some mutants to it, and now it's doing 4 damage, gaining a me4 life, and drawing multiple cards every time I connect for damage.
And it's also something that Vadrok brings back, so yay!
Exactly. That is another powerful non-creature spell. So Staggering Insight is a card that I think is actually quite well positioned against what a lot of aggressive decks are doing, and if you have the ability to get it back if something happens to it, it's a really valuable tool in the arsenal. All
right, Dan, you have sold us on this deck. Now I want to know, what are some of the coolest things you pulled up? Did you get like multiple Vadroks on top of each other? Please tell me yes.
Oh yes. So we got to talk about that. Vadrok, Apex of Thunder, is a legendary creature. We've heard that drawing more than one copy of a legend is, it's not good. You can't have 2 in play at once. Or can you? Right? The mutate ability is so interesting. If you mutate a Vadrok onto another Vadrok, it will just absorb the powers of the second Vadrok, and it will now trigger twice. So if you have a Vadrok in play, you add a second Vadrok, you get 2 triggers, you're casting 2 things directly out of the graveyard. It's a huge tempo swing.
That sounds like Value City to me, and I definitely want to take a look at that place.
Yeah, so I think this deck is configured in such a way that that's what I'm trying to do. That's my end game. Get to a point where, maybe we've been going back and forth, but at some point they don't know, but I know that I'm setting up a turn where I'm going to get Vadrok, trigger it once, trigger it twice. Maybe I'm going to flash in a Sea Dasher Octopus for another surprise trigger. I had one game where I even mutated a third Vadrok onto what was already a 2 Vadrok pile, and I got 3 triggers all at once.
Oh my goodness.
It's really
Do you
cool.
run out of spells in the graveyard at all? Or are you just like, nah, this is fine? Because that's also one cool thing about Vadrok is he doesn't exile, right? There's a lot of cards who bring something back from the graveyard, like we saw last week with Storm Herald, which is like, oh, cool, you bring it back, and then whoop, it goes away. But Vadrok, he's just like, nah, this is cool. I'm just going to recast this forever and ever and always.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so interesting and exciting about the card. I had been initially trying Dreadhorde Arcanist as a card to pair with Vadrok. That actually exiles a card for good, but Vadrok just leaves it there, right? So if it's something as simple as a shock or anything else, any kind of red spell, it just stays there and you have access to it throughout the game. That extends also to things like Counter Magic. Ether Gust is a great one to rebuy.
Oh, yeah.
I had a great game against a mono-red Cavalcade of Calamity deck where they got me really, really low. But I realized that once I had answered their initial assault, even though I was only like 4 life or something, as long as I held open mana for Sea Dasher Octopus onto my Vadrok, I always had access to a Flame Sweep to defend whatever they were trying to do. So they weren't able to break through.
Wow.
And I was able to just sort of fend them off that way. The deck played really, really well at flash speed and navigating tricky situations like that.
So in the past, we've highlighted some cards already that maybe had a little more success in the older formats. But I think finally, we might have actually found a really, really powerful shell in Standard. Now, would this actually be a deck that you would recommend people to actually try out? Like, we asked you about the ramp shells before, and you said it was just kind of a weaker version of other decks. Like, how do you feel about this deck after having such a good record with it?
So I feel like this deck is a bit unique. I mean, it's occupying a spot in the metagame that is not currently seeing a lot of success. So it's not similar to that many other decks in the format. That being said, let me tell you about some of the things that could go wrong, and then maybe you could tell me whether you recommend this deck. So everything I've been describing so far about all the cool things that happen when you successfully mutate onto Vadrok, that's great, but that assumes that you have something in play for Vadrok to merge with, and that they're not trying to disrupt you in any way. So if they remove your Vadrok, you're actually in a lot of trouble. Maybe it was only a card for card exchange, but in terms of time, or tempo as we call it, you need to find a time to get another creature into play and then mutate Vadrok onto that. So even something as simple as them just bouncing your creature is a huge setback. That being said, spot removal is not that widely played in like a Fire's metagame. So there's a good chance to actually execute this successfully, and Teferi to protect you helps a ton. So I had some games where I had some big setbacks with opponents killing my base creatures before I could get Vadrok off. But apart from that, I was pretty impressed with how often this successfully did the thing.
I have a question for you. Do you think people are a lot more willing to kill the itty-bitty creatures because of the threat of Luca, possibly, out of nowhere? Just be like, boom, Agent of Treachery. I've noticed that. I can never keep anything alive. If it's a little 1-drop, it dies almost immediately.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. You'll find yourself paired against decks that are trying to kill everything on sight. But what's so cool about this deck is the ability to change roles. The way that I sideboarded and changed up my deck between games really varied drastically depending on what the opponent was presenting me with. So one of the things that you can do is switch to a more flash control deck. You don't need to mutate a Sea Dasher Octopus. You can just hold your mana open for Mystical Disputes, Counter Magic, flash it in as a 2/2 at instant speed, and just try to nickel and dime your way to 2-for-1s the old-fashioned way, like it used to be. So the deck is actually capable of adjusting to counterplay like that. But I think that if someone is really trying to destroy every creature, you might be in some...
Yeah, I mean, that's the one thing that I noticed when I just looked at this specific build. Oftentimes, we try to come up with some wacky decks with a lot of different pieces to make something work. And oftentimes when you do that, you have to play a lot of bad cards, right? Or cards that you're not really happy having in your hand because they don't really do anything. But the thing about this deck is nearly every card is just a good card, right? Yeah. I mean, you have 8 Planeswalkers in your deck that's going to provide you value. And you have, Bone Crusher Giant. And, even Vadrok, worst case scenario, you can still play it as a big 3-mana, 3/3 flyer with First Strike. So it feels to me that, kind of the backup plan of not being able to assemble your combo, you can still kind of play a reasonable back and forth game and win, a good percentage of your matches that way.
Yeah, I think I used every mode of Vadrok, and Vadrok has a lot of different modes. I mean, it can just be a base 3/3 combat creature that can defend your planeswalkers from a big rush of creatures. It can be part of a giant mutant pile that's casting spells. I got creatures as big as 9-10 power sometimes with flying and lifelink and all that.
Wow, nice.
So it's really a versatile deck. The one thing that it can't do is it can't keep up with some of the big end games of some of the top decks in Standard. So when you're paired against a deck like Wilderness Reclamation, Fire's decks, if they're going very, very big into the late game, it's sometimes hard to find cards within this sort of Jeskai spells mid-range deck that can keep up with those really heavy-hitting plays. So in those matchups, it becomes important to actually put the foot on the gas and try to kill them quickly with Sprite Dragons and Royal Scions, that kind of thing, going in for damage as fast as you can.
Yeah, so Dan, I mean, again, I think this deck looks really, really exciting. Really, really, it's a fun new take on playing a strategy. It's not the same thing that everybody's playing. We're not just seeing a bunch of Yorions flying around. You have this tempo strategy, and it really seems like that combination of just having a bunch of evasive creatures with cards like the Royal Scions and ways to get value back off the Vadrok might actually be really well positioned right now when everybody's just trying to muck up the ground and kind of get to the late game.
Yeah, the deck is a ton of fun. I really recommend it. You get to play a lot of great games of Magic with this deck.
Dan, this deck looks super cool. I can't wait to give it a go, and I'm sure our viewers would love to try it too. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again a little later.
Yeah, can't wait.
Alrighty, friends, that is all she wrote for Standard. We're going to go and take a look at Pioneer and Modern in 2 other videos. If you want to check them out, be sure to click the link. Go check down in the description. They will be there. As always, leave a like, subscribe, ring that bell so you know when these episodes do go live, and we'll see you again very, very soon.